welcome both the folks who are online and people here in the sanctuary for what's kind of exciting, an in-person book talk through our partnership with the Jewish Book Council. So I'm Rabbi Daniel Stein. I'm the rabbi here at Congregation B'nai Shalom. I cannot talk any louder. We could probably turn up the microphone, but no, it's very close. It's right where it should be, but maybe we can make it louder if that's helpful for folks. But I cannot be any louder, for which I apologize. So this is our, really for first in a while of in-person book talks with the Jewish Book Council. People may know that we've partnered with the Jewish Book Council for several years through a really fruitful partnership with the Contra Costa JCC to bring authors here in person. And then during the pandemic, we had really many wonderful book talks online, which we're continuing. And we're delighted to have folks here today. I always tell people just before we start that the speakers who come to us for the Jewish Book Council are remarkable in two ways. First of all, they're remarkable because they are thought leaders in the Jewish world who are interested in spreading their work, and it's really always great to have wonderful leaders. But also they speak for free, which is great. And so I mention that they speak for free because I want you to buy their book, okay? So as a kindness to them, and also because this book happens to be really excellent and practical and useful, and we're going to hear about it. So you should buy it for that reason, and because this talk today is remarkable that they're speaking out of the generosity of their hearts, by Judaism Disrupted by Rabbi Michael Strassfeld. I'll put that out there. So I want to thank the Contra Costa JCC, and I want to introduce our author today. There are cards at the back. The rabbi is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll moderate some conversations. There are cards in the back where people can put their questions. If you're on Zoom, Stu is going to write your questions. This is very old-fashioned. He's going to take your questions from the chat and write them on a card and give them to me. So if you have questions on Zoom, please feel free to ask. Let me just say a word about Rabbi Strassfeld before we begin, which is, there's a lot I could say about you, Rabbi. I do think it's important, even though the Jewish catalog is, from the 70s, I think for me and for a lot of folks in this room, it was really a very, very influential text in helping us think about how we construct Judaism. So if you've been part of a chavurah at a congregation, if you thought about doing Judaism on your own, or maybe I'll just ask, who has a copy of the Jewish catalog in their house, right? So a lot of folks here are owners of the first, second, third, or maybe Jewish Kids catalog. And that movement was deeply influential in shaping Jewish life. But over the years, beyond your work with the Jewish catalog, you've been a Jewish educator and served at two really remarkable congregations in Manhattan as a rabbi at Anshe Chesed and the Society for Advancement of Judaism. So we're really fortunate today and written several books. We're really fortunate to have a real thought leader in the Jewish world. And as I said, we had lunch with some of our board members before the talk. It's really remarkable to have the opportunity to be with somebody who helped to really shape the Jewish present to think about the Jewish future. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity. So please join me in welcoming Rabbi Michael Strassfeld.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, thank you. I really appreciate the welcome, and thank you, Rabbi, and to the community and people online. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to have a conversation after I say a few words about the book. And you're exactly right that I'm really happy to talk about the book because I want the ideas that are in the book to be part of the conversation about the Jewish future. And I also just, before I begin, really just to acknowledge that we are in a difficult moment, and with everything that happened on October 7th and all the families that are hurting, and all of us hoping that those who are hostage will be returned very soon and unharmed, and broadly hoping that the suffering that's going on will soon come to a resolution. So I just want to acknowledge that. I'm not here to talk about Israel and this situation, but I felt it would be wrong not to put it forward as that's something that's in our hearts and minds right now. So switch to really beginning with the Jewish catalog. So thanks for the introduction. As it happens, it was 50 years ago that I co-edited the Jewish catalog, and it appeared 50 years ago, whose tagline was a do-it-yourself kit, which described our desire to show people how to embrace a vibrant Judaism for themselves. The book was a product of the Jewish counterculture and reflected a new approach to Jewish life led by a group of young Jews. As a phenomenon, it paralleled the general counterculture in America, which opposed the war in Vietnam and embraced, as the phrase went, embraced sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Similarly, we rejected many of the forms and values of our parents' Judaism. We picketed the national meeting of the Jewish Federations in Boston in 1979, calling for a shift in priorities on the part of the federations to support efforts in Jewish education and Jewish identity. We created Chavarot, small intentional communities that were not led by rabbis, but instead encouraged all of its members to lead services or to give the Devar Torah, the sermon on Shabbat. Services were informal in style with communal singing, particularly of Hasidic nigunim, wordless melodies. This contrasted with our experience of suburban synagogues at the time, where participation was often restricted to the rabbi and cantor, except for the wonderful responsive readings. Yeah, you should laugh. The Jewish counterculture had many different components, from Ezrat Nashim, a group advocating for an equal role in Jewish life for women, publications like Response Magazine, and many other examples, the Coalition for Alternatives in Jewish Education, the National Chavarot Committee. There was also a growth of Judaica artists, creating ketubot and chanukiot and other ritual objects. The Jewish catalog, with its sales of over 300,000 copies, just of the first, was the most influential of these phenomena. Why? I believe the catalog gave expression to a Jewish renaissance in America that sought to embrace pieces of the Jewish past, even as it remained rooted in the contemporary moment. The proverbial question asked in every generation by the leaders of Jewish institutions, and which was asked of me a few minutes ago by some of you board members, where are the young people? Was clearly answered in the pictures in the catalog of young Jews doing Jewish, young people who looked like their peers with really long hair and tie-dyed clothing. The catalog proclaimed you could be Jewish and American. You didn't have to choose one or the other. There were other phenomena during this period that had profound and positive effects on Jewish life. Jewish feminism, the spread of Jewish studies programs in universities, the participation of LGBTQ Jews, and the identification of American Jewry with Zionism following the Six-Day War. While most of the young Jews in the Jewish counterculture came from conservative, reform, or secular Jewish backgrounds, I came from a modern Orthodox background. My father was a rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue in the old Jewish neighborhood in Boston. I went to Maimonides, a modern Orthodox day school. In those days, it was not unusual for Orthodox Jews to be politically liberal. My father, in fact, marched with Dr. King in Selma. Later, in my college years, I drifted away from Orthodoxy because I no longer accepted many of its beliefs. After graduation, I found a Jewish home at Chavarat Shalom, a small intentional community near Boston. Our Judaism was eclectic. We like to say that we took a commitment to social justice from Reform, a critical study of text from conservative Judaism, an engagement in practice from Orthodoxy, and a piety and a joyousness from Hasidism. The Jewish catalog came out of the Chavurah. We decided to write about the Jewish life that we and our friends were living. While I had never planned to be a writer as a career, the story of my life can be framed by the books that I have written. I like to say that I write the same book over and over again, except each time I am a different person, and the times are different as well. Yet each book is motivated by my desire to make accessible the richness of the Jewish tradition that I was given access to growing up, knowing that most Jews have limited access to that tradition. If the catalog was a how-to book, my new book, Judaism Disrupted, a spiritual manifesto for the 21st century, addresses a different question. Not how to build a Jewish life, but why. Or more to the point, why bother? While most Jews these days feel proud of being Jewish, many people find its rituals and institutions irrelevant. A few months ago, I was at a gallery in Soho for a panel of artists talking about the intersection of being an artist and being Jewish. People on the board heard this already. Each of the panelists introduced themselves. One talked of his art and then said he was a pretty good Jew. The next talked of her art and said she was a mediocre Jew. The gallery owner chimed in, who was Jewish, of course, said she was a bad Jew. And then the first artist said, who had said, I'm a good Jew, said, I was being sarcastic. It was clear that all of them defined being a good Jew as attending synagogue, observing the laws of kashrut or Shabbat, and that those things they felt disinterested in or incompetent in doing. As bad Jews, they felt that there was no place for them in Jewish life. For me, this summarized the category mistake that was the impetus for my book. Judaism is not about being a good Jew. Let me say that again. Judaism is not about being a good Jew, that is, doing those, what I like to call those Jewishly Jewish things that only Jews do. For too many people, like the artists, Judaism is mostly a bunch of rituals disconnected from anything of importance to them. The premise of my book is that the purpose of Judaism is not to make us better Jews, but to help us become good people, offering us wisdom and practices to take the most precious gift we have been given in our lives. We're given our lives, the most precious gift we have been given, that is our lives, and live with purpose. We live in disruptive times. For the Jewish people, this is nothing new. When the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, Rabbinic Judaism responded by creating a Judaism that was portable, that could be taken wherever the winds of misfortune would carry them in the world. Today, we need something different. In the open society in which we live and thrive, we need a Judaism that is permeable, enabling us to interact with the world around us, that is more inclusive and more accessible. This requires a re-envisioning of Judaism, particularly some of the paradigms basic to Rabbinic Judaism. One problematic legacy of Rabbinic Judaism is its emphasis on dualities. In particular, it seems to be organized around distinctions between kosher and non-kosher, pure and impure, permitted and forbidden. Doesn't that reflect a dualistic notion of the world? The problematic nature of distinction becomes clear when we remember that it was not so long ago that women couldn't be called to the Torah, or women couldn't become rabbis. Too often, distinctions lead to hierarchy, making one category in its essence better than another. The story of America over the last century is one of expanding inclusivity. Women won the right to vote, segregation was ended, and marriage equality became the law of the land. This inclusivity came through struggle, and obviously there is still much to be done. However, the arc has been clear, and this has been echoed in the Jewish world as well. It is in our best natures to move away from exclusion and toward inclusion. If this is true, then should the traditional paradigm of distinction remain the basic way we understand Judaism? I am not suggesting a Judaism without boundaries. There is a difference between right and wrong, and between caring and indifference. But these distinctions are based on moral differences, not on people's identity. I'm asking us to think about the fundamental way we structure our world and how Judaism should reflect that thinking. This is a greater challenge than just eliminating the hierarchical distinctions. It asks whether the paradigm that was so helpful to rabbinic Judaism of dividing the world into two categories of kosher and treif, and an occasional third category of parv, neutral, is the paradigm that will help us create Jewish identity in this modern world. The organized Jewish community is worried about its future. How can it survive in an open society? Obviously, these are real concerns, but for Jews who embrace that open society, the answers cannot lie in a decision to stand at the border to guard our Judaism. We have tried that tactic for over a century, and it has failed. And not because we haven't said it well or clearly. It has failed because we can't create effective boundaries that are not just invisible, but that run counter to the way we live our lives. We embrace American society. We reject any notion that we are different from our fellow Americans. We don't want ghetto walls except when we want Jews to marry Jews. Perhaps we need a Judaism based on something other than distinctions in order to give structure and expression to Jewish life in this open and fluid 21st century. Well, if Judaism is not about distinctions, perhaps it's about law. After all, the notion of halakha, Judaism as law, is central to rabbinic Judaism. Yet the majority of liberal Jews have rejected the binding nature of halakha. And while conservative Judaism still proclaims a commitment to halakha as law, it also believes that halakha can change, as it has regarding the role of women and LGBTQ people. I want to suggest that lacking any enforcement measure, and the fact that the vast majority of us reject the notion of a God who punishes Jews who eat lobster, we would be better to understand Judaism not as law, but as practice. The traditional term minhag, custom, could be useful here. It's also helpful to understand halakha as a spiritual path, relating to the original meaning of its root, halach, to go. Each of us in our lives are on our life's journey. Halakha, in this understanding, suggests that there is wisdom and awareness that can help us on our way. It is the spiritual practice of the Jewish people honed over centuries of discussions and developments. Like any practice, it requires a regular commitment. You will never learn to play the piano if you only practice 3 times a year. For our lives, we can imagine a system that does not focus on fulfilling a commandment, but that still appreciates the importance of actually performing mitzvot. Something happens in the doing that is different from just thinking about the values. Thereby, Judaism would remain a practice of doing, not just thinking or believing. This would be a system without an emphasis on sin. The obligation is a self-commitment because you believe that a spiritual life requires both practice and discipline. This is, I'm just skipping a little bit. Halakha is a practice that can make you a better person or more satisfied or happier. But its focus is not only on you. Its focus is also on the other people in your life, as well as social justice around the world and the health of this planet. We begin with the most fundamental of Jewish values, that we are all images of God and our purpose is to do good. We know that how we think about what we do is critical. In Jewish tradition, this is called kavanah, intention. In 21st century spirituality, it is called awareness. Practices like meditation or yoga are essential aspects of contemporary American Jewish spirituality. Can we find sources for awareness practice in the Jewish tradition? I argue that Judaism, in fact, has many awareness practices that just are not commonly described as such. Everyone can understand why ethical commandments, such as the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, are of value. The challenging part is the observance of rituals. What larger purpose is served by not turning on electrical appliances on Shabbat or not mixing milk and meat together? Let me suggest that the purpose of rituals is to remind us of our values and goals. They are no different than paying attention to our breath during silent meditation. For example, when we pause before we eat to recite words of blessing, we remind ourselves that we should be grateful for food and the gift of life. The purpose isn't found in reciting the blessing. Rather, we say the blessings to heighten our awareness of gratitude. A daily meditation practice is meant to help train us to pay attention not only while sitting and meditating, but to be more aware throughout the day. Judaism's awareness practice is a little different than meditation because it focuses on cultivating a specific aspect such as gratitude, compassion, or equanimity. Unfortunately, as I say, for too many people, Jewish rituals have become rote or disconnected from any discernible purpose. So let me take one specific example to show you what I'm talking about. A ritual that is, I think, fairly widely observed, mezuzah. Many Jews have a mezuzah, a little box with a scroll inside on the doorpost, particularly of their of the outer the door to go outside. But unfortunately, like many other things, once hung, it becomes like wallpaper. It's there but not really seen. So I suggest a practice of considering looking or touching the mezuzah when you leave home in the morning to mark that transition from home to outside, from home to work, and to mark that transition as saying, I want to take with me a spiritual kavanah, a spiritual intention for the day. And that could be, I like to use this example of, because I live in Manhattan, to pay attention to nature, which is easy not to see it all in Manhattan. Or it could be something specific that's in your coming day. That again, you could know you have a meeting that this afternoon at work that you think is going to be challenging, and so your intention is to carry with you an extra measure of patience into that room. It could also be taking whatever you think is a basic principle in how you live your life and reminding yourself, not that you forget, but reminding yourself that you want to respond, for instance, you want to respond with caring and compassion when you walk out, and again, this is particularly challenging in Manhattan, when you walk the streets of Manhattan and are faced with people who have no homes and other social issues. And it's not as though, and that's a kind of a basic way that you look at life. And the question is, how do you respond? But what you're carrying with you is that intention to respond, not to turn away or pretend that you don't see what's before you. Any of those things could be your intention to take with you. And similarly, you might mark the moment of coming home to leave behind the dust and distress of the day, the stress of the day, and leave it behind as you re-enter, make the transition back at home. And the suggestion is to take, take a moment. It's literally a moment. It's not half an hour. It's not a long period of time. Not to mark every time you go from one room to another in your house, because it'd be difficult or impossible to do, but really to have something that is practical, but yet has meaning. So in my book, I outline, 11 core principles with simple practices, some traditional, others brand new, to help bring awareness into our lives. Think about an intention while I'm drinking my water. So to bring some awareness into our lives, cultivating qualities such as gratitude for our blessings, compassion for fellow human beings, or a sense of satisfaction rather than an endless striving for what we think we lack. In addition to reconstructing rabbinic sources, I draw inspiration from Hasidism, not so much how it is practiced today in Borough Park or in Israel, but in the teachings of the Hasidic masters beginning in the 18th century with the Baal Shem Tov. Let me just mention a few of their key understandings of the nature of religious life. First, the Jewish mysticism that existed before Hasidism saw the world as a temptation to be avoided as much as possible. Materialism was the enemy of spirituality and holiness. Hasidism instead believed that you can find holiness in the everyday. The religious life didn't only consist of praying or studying Torah, the Jewish things I mentioned earlier, but rather that everything you did had the possibility to be holy. The Bible commentator Nachmanides said, there is no mitzvah in the Torah, it's not one of the 613 commandments, that you should have pleasant conversations with people. But that is one of the ways of doing good in the world. Instead of rejecting the world, Hasidism saw it as offering endless possibilities of doing good, of effecting tikkun, healing of the brokenness we all experience. One other way that's particularly surprising in Hasidism was its notion of the dynamic quality of Torah. Even though they continued to observe the traditional halakha, the Hasidim did, even at the beginning, but at the beginning, in the 18th century, they were in some ways on the cutting edge of Jewish life, theologically and in other ways. And as you know today, they've become the ultra-traditionists of the Jewish community, rejecting modernity. Still, Hasidism had this notion of contemporary Torah, as in this statement of the Degel Machane Ephraim, who was the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. He says, I quote, "Thus in every generation, its teachers complete the Torah, because the Torah is expounded in each generation according to what is necessary in that generation, and what is the root of the soul of that generation." I find that a remarkable understanding of a tradition that is a tradition but in constant change, and the challenge to discover what is the tradition for today. And it echoes in many ways the teachings of Mordechai Kaplan, who was very far from mysticism and Hasidism, who talked about Judaism as an evolving religious civilization, and that each generation of Jews, similarly to the Degel, needs to find what the Torah is for our time. And also Kaplan's notion of Judaism as a civilization, which meant that he defined Judaism not just religiously, but as involving art and music, and even he was really the inventor of the notion of a shul with a pool, that even physical activities were part of Jewish life, and is very similar in many ways to Hasidism. In trying to understand what might be the heart of Torah, I came across a teaching of the Hasidic master, the Sfat Emet, who lived in the second half of the 19th century, so he's later than the early founders. He asked, what is the essence of Torah? And I won't take the time to do that, but take a moment, and if you had to answer that question with one or two words, think, how would you answer it? So, so he answers it, and I would bet, unless you read the book and know the answer, that he answers that the essence of Torah is freedom. Freedom. Torah is not, he says, as commonly believed, about 613 commandments. Rather, it is 613 counsels that teach us how to achieve freedom. Our biggest challenge is to take the precious gift of life and do as much as we can with it. We live our life with the consciousness that we are limited by our mortality. Torah reminds us of our potential, for we are also created in the image of God. Torah can free us from the grind of everyday life where day follows day, week follows week, and year follows year. Freedom is an awareness of what life is and can be. Torah is meant to be an ongoing pointer to the precious blessing of life. Torah suggests that our mortality doesn't have to define our existence. We have the ability and the freedom to create, to think, and to feel. For more than 3,000 years, the Jewish people have engaged in a discussion of how to live a life of meaning, how to be a spiritual mensch. We have the written Torah and the oral Torah. Our task is to continue to study the written Torah, and as we bring our insights and our questions and challenges to the text, we create the oral Torah, which changes in each generation. We live in the tension of the written Torah and our contemporary understanding, each challenging the other. That is the task of all those who are students of Torah. It is why we need two Torahs, the written and the oral. One without the other would be incomplete. And who is engaged in this extraordinary process? The wisest scholars of our time? No, all of us are participants, each adding the piece of our lives to the Torah until it is complete. According to a mystical tradition, each Jew has one letter of the Torah, our own special letter that we learn and develop and raise up to the Holy One. This notion is based on a tradition that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah scroll, and there were 600,000 Jews who left Egypt. Needless to say, neither count is really accurate. But each person's Torah in this understanding is different and unique. This vision that each of us has our own special letter of the Torah is empowering, but also at the same time frightening. For it means that with so many Jews distant from Judaism, whole parts of the Torah are being left unread. According to Jewish law, if even one letter is missing from a Torah scroll, It is pasul. It's not kosher. It can't be used in the synagogue until it is fixed. Lacking even one Jew, one letter, the Torah scroll is incomplete. Our task is to invite everyone to find their place in the Torah scroll, adding their Torah, their understanding to ours and to those that came before, will help complete the Torah. Judaism Disrupted is for anyone seeking to find within our tradition new ways to continue to unroll the Torah scroll, to find meaning in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a quick reminder, there are cards for questions that can be passed up to me, or if folks online have questions, Sue's going to pass around some cards. You covered a whole bunch in those remarks. I'm going to start back, if it's okay, with maybe a question about Chavurat Shalom and the attitudes of Chavurat Shalom and its relationship to the present moment. So many of my teachers at the Jewish Theological Seminary had connections in various ways to Chavurat Shalom. So a lot of the people who were active in this community became leaders and educators in the Jewish world. One of my beloved teachers was David Roskies at JTS, who described the attitude of Chavurat Shalom towards the organized Jewish community as Oedipal, which I think you touched on a little bit as well in terms of the rejection of your parents' Judaism and the skepticism that folks at Chavurat Shalom had both for institutions and for rabbis. And yet many folks became leaders of institutions and became rabbis. So I guess I'd like maybe just to, as a sort of starting point, to reflect on the function of institutions like these and personalities like us in relationship to the disruption of Judaism that you're advocating for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that broadly what the Chabura was trying to do, and it was reflected in the way I talked about the catalog in terms of feeling that there was too much passivity in Jewish life, and that the subtitle, the Do-It-Yourself Kit, meant that we were calling for Jews to really engage in Judaism with literally with their own hands. There was a lot of making things in that culture, and in the 60s culture in general, and it was interesting as much as a number of people in Chavurat Shalom and in other similar groups became important in Jewish life and Jewish institutions. Many of them became important in terms of Jewish studies. The number of people who became rabbis was smaller than the number of people who became Jewish studies professors, and partly there was expanding field in Jewish studies, and I think there was also an ambivalence about being a rabbi, right? A community that said everybody should lead, and yet, like so much else in the 60s and the 70s, was filled with contradictions, right? So SDS was totally egalitarian and except all the leadership were men, right? So, and in Chavurat Shalom, there was, we were all equal, except Art Green was more equal than other people just because both of how much he knew and because of his personality. And Art, in fact, struggled with that do I really want to be, the Rebbe or I don't want to be the Rebbe, but then I don't get to call the, it's all that stuff. I became a rabbi at the age of 41, I think partly because I felt ambivalent about this notion of professional leadership. But at some point I I had to stop pretending like I was just an average Jew, just like every other average Jew, because I wasn't. I had, both the modern Orthodox background and the Jewish knowledge I had meant the truth was I wasn't like everybody else, and it would be more honest to say I had a lot to teach, and not everybody had that kind of thing. And I think in some ways the Chavurah movement suffered by not having leadership. When everybody's a leader, then it's harder to get things accomplished and done. So it was a kind of balance, but I think the really positive thing about it was, as you suggested, that it shifted kind of the flavor, that's not the right word, but the flavor of Judaism. That notion that people should participate, that rabbis should come off from the giant bema, be far away to as authority figures, but should come down on, and speak to people on the same level. That we wanted to narrow the gap between the leadership and the community. That even the leadership should be more informal. Even the services, the music of services, changed from totally cantorial style to mixture or the Hasidic melodies and Carlebach, which were kind of folk songs, and the Reform movement. There were different, Debbie Friedman, other kinds of folk songs. So I think that was a very important shift in affecting American Judaism. And as you suggested, the question, which is in some ways the question I keep on asking myself as I do different books, what's the shift now? What's the challenge now? What would the Jewish catalog of today be saying in response to the reality of American Jewish life?
Thank you. And I think sort of related to that, I mentioned before that this is, if you have a chance to buy the book, and you should buy the book from Stu afterwards, it's a very practical book in the sense that it gives recommendations and even techniques for how to engage with Jewish practices. But something struck me in your answer to my previous question, which is that at least in my own life, I think about how much energy I've invested in my own Jewish education to make the rituals and texts of Judaism meaningful to me. In some sense, there's a great deal of privilege in that because philanthropists and communities and all sorts of organizations have invested in me so that I could have the type of Jewish education that I have. And I feel like it's not really possible for the vast majority of the people that I serve and work with to have the same type of Jewish education, to access what are, I think, sometimes esoteric or strange customs and rituals. And so again, I think that the book does a good job of sort of helping us into that. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that, those points.
Yeah, no, well, I think that's really like the theme of my life, which is take these rich treasures and make them accessible to people. I mean, we originally had thought of calling the Jewish catalog the Jewish Whole Earth Catalog, for those who remember the Whole Earth Catalog. And we didn't, partly because it sounded just too derivative, but it was also the Whole Earth Catalog. If I always use this example, I never did this, but there was a whole thing about geodesic domes and Buckminster Fuller, for those who remember this. Anyway, so the Whole Earth Catalog would say, if you're interested in this, get this book by Buckminster Fuller, and there would be this picture of the geodesic dome and a little excerpt. So it was the Whole Earth Catalog would refer you to. So the Jewish catalog would say, oh, you want to build a sukkah? Look in Shulchan Aruch, chapter 248, section 7, and it's in Hebrew, so that's going to be useless to you. And it actually doesn't tell you how to build one. It only tells you how not to build, what's a kosher sukkah, right? So we realized the catalog had to be the resource itself. And I think in some ways that's, that my life, and I'm sure to a great extent your life, is to take some of the treasures, and it's both practices, and I'll just give this example. So I was about to say, I draw upon some things that are even obscure in the Orthodox community. So you may have, many of you may probably have heard this, that there's two categories of mitzvot, of commandments, of the 613s, those between you and God, and those between you and your fellow human being. Okay, I heard that for 60 years of my life, whatever. And then it turns out there's actually a third category, which is not very well known. It's mitzvot bein adam la'atzmo, between a person and themselves. And it felt such a contemporary idea that because I think spirituality or modernity, people are very much focused on themselves, sometimes too much focused on themselves, narcissism. But I think there is a focus on self, and I think that's part of living in a post-Freud time where we have a sense of the interior world, right? And so, and there is, even without this category, there is Musar, which is a tradition of focusing on ethical qualities that became a movement in the 19th century. But to have a third category of mitzvot that comes from the tradition that I just didn't make up yesterday feels important to me, right? And so it's saying like there's three focuses of life. One is that which is larger than yourself. Some of us call that God, some people call it the universe. Other people in life, right? Both big ways, social justice or small, and then on yourself as well, right? So some of that is saying the tradition is concerned about that, and the tradition has some teachings about it and some wisdom about it, and that's what I'm trying to present in the book, to say that there's a lot here. There's a lot also to be left behind. That's also true, and and only time will tell which of these things are still around in 100 years, and which were like, oh, Shabbat on Sunday, that's a great idea. No, it didn't work. Looked like it was a good idea, but it didn't work, right?
There are several questions here generally that would like to expand maybe a little bit more on the notion of God as you understand it, or theology, or if personal theology maybe isn't what you'd like to touch on, where theology fits into this disruption of Judaism.
Yeah, it was in some ways the hardest chapter to write. It's one of the 11 core principles. God, and there's subsections of that about prayer, which is also challenging, and idolatry. There were 3 subsections of. So I think I'm going to talk about idolatry actually. So I don't think it could be like idolatry is one of these concepts that was important in biblical times, is not important now. I don't think we're worried about people bowing down to idols. Some people have said, "Oh, well, we have new idols, whether it's money, fame, all that kind of thing," and well, that's okay. I actually think that what idolatry is really about is thinking that you have the truth, you have God's word, and other people don't. Other people have the wrong idea. I mean, if they have your idea, that's good. But and so I use the story of the golden calf, that the problem was they took something that was fluid and made it in one form, and they said, Elo Elohecha Yisrael. This, and I add only this, is the God of Israel. And I think that's idolatry. It's basically a fundamentalism that says I have it, the truth, and my Torah or my Dharma, whatever it is the truth, and others is not. And I think that's actually a challenge of contemporary religion. And so, not to completely avoid the God question, is I like the image of the opposite image, right? That when Moses asks God at the burning bush, "Who should I say sent me?" God says, "Yeah, sure, yeah. I will be what I will be." That is, God is fluid. In that sense, I agree with Maimonides in some level that you can't know God. It's beyond knowing, and I kind of, so in some ways that's I believe there's a God. I believe that the universe isn't random. It just didn't sort of evolved. But to say much more specifically about God. But I think for me, ultimately, I would say the knowledge that the understanding that there's something larger than myself in the universe is a critical spiritual understanding. That if you don't have that, like that's a real problem. And you can call it God, you can call it universe, you can.
And is there maybe a practice in here that's helped you along that path for yourself in terms of deepening that connection or understanding? You touched on them. This is a practice a little bit.
I think this may not be what you're asking, but I think for me, the moment, I say in the book, so I don't know. I could say I had this moment, or I had some moments where I felt God, like I felt this experience. I think the times I've come closest to that is when I'm leading a service and singing a nigun, a wordless melody, and it's kind of a practice in itself. That is, you keep on, like to say, like Kemperma, like you would sing everything in the songster twice, and then you go to the next song. So in this, you just stay with it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just singing it over, because it's a spiritual practice. And in those moments, I felt I wasn't, even though I was leading, I wasn't distracted. Usually I closed my eyes so I wouldn't see the person nodding off in the front pew or something, but it was just being present. And it felt that sense of presence, and it was connected. And it was sort of, there was a kind of nakedness and that in a very innocent way,
So I'm going to try. We have maybe 2 more questions. I'll try to get in our little bit of time. So make sure that we respect all of our time. So I'll give you both of them. You can answer which one you would like. Okay, how about that? We'll do that.
Multiple
okay,
choice.
Yes, that's right. So because they're not wholly related, although maybe you can make them. A first question is around thinking about anti-Semitism in terms of our Jewish identities and where that may or may not play in. And the second question, which is the one I'm maybe a little more partial to, is a question around Jewish education. A lot of synagogues like ours have 5 or 6 hours a week that we're trying to transmit this tradition. If we don't have a Jewish pope, but if we had a Jewish pope and you were to distill into something that we could transmit in 5 or 6 hours a week, where would your priorities be?
Look, I think it's a huge challenge. Joy and I were just discussing this, and the Jewish education rather than the anti-Semitism. And that's also a big challenge. But I think at the center part of the challenge is the commitment to Hebrew, which seems essential, and yet I think overall it's not been successful with teaching, that it's going to carry forward, except a few people who went on and continued. The JCC Manhattan, Joy worked with, they have, they basically do, it's online, what's it called? Hebrew homepage, where the kid's working online with like a college student, so it's one-on-one, and it has the advantages of a one-on-one rather than whatever number of kids in the classroom. But just park that over there. I think it's all about why, to use my book. In other words, you can't teach. It's just like what you were saying about teaching Jews everything because there's not enough time and they don't have enough time. So it's a kal v'chomer. It's even more so with Hebrew school because there's even less time and less attention. It's the end of the day, all the problem. So I think it's the importance is the why. Like, why is this important? Why is this meaningful? Why is this going to help you in your life as an adolescent, where you're dealing with a million difficult issues? And if you don't really, remember what Shmini Atzeret is, which most of my congregants never remembered anyways, I explained it every year. And it was like, if you don't, it's almost, we have to teach the holidays. And of course you have to do, but I think it's really those things that may be what the kid is going to carry with them, 10 or 20 years later, and maybe at that point, continue some Jewish education because, that was meaningful. But to know what Shavuot is, it feels, how could you have a Jewish education not know about Shavuot, right? And parents have these expectations. Like, my kid went to Hebrew school, I can't do the 4 questions. Like, what was the point of sending them, right? And I get that, I get like that. But I think it really requires that kind of, that's what my opinion is. It requires that kind of shift to why and less the facts and certainly less Jewish history. I love history, but I think Jewish history is, maybe they don't teach Jewish history anymore. But
so we're going to wrap up only because of time, and actually Rabbi is heading right to the airport after we're done today, so I want to make sure he has.
We have a few minutes.
Okay, well, so then, would you like to
I'm happy to do it down to the wire. I feel bad about it.
So then, if you'd like to take on maybe
it's the only plane we can get and get home at 2 a.m. in the morning, rather than do the red eyes, sort of.
So if you want to touch on the anti-Semitism issue, if you'd like, or
I would. If you have something else, I think. Look, I was. If you asked me 10 years ago, I'd say anti-Semitism, it's not really important, right? Some people are really into it. I was never into but even before the last couple months, whatever, after Pittsburgh, you can't sort of say it's, one lunatic someplace, who cares, so it's a problem. And the current situation has magnified the problem. And it's scary, and as I say, it was never part of I'm actually basically an optimistic person, And, you know, I just, it's hard to see how this is going to work out well. But I think we have to, I would say, this is what I would say. I would say that the challenge here, as with many other things, is to hold the balance. Is not to say, nah, it's not important, it's just a few crazy people. But also not to let it define who we are and how we look at the world, right? We shouldn't become, it used to be like, and Joe was talking about conversion earlier today. It used to be like we were suspect of people who wanted to convert to Judaism, like this is 50, 60 years ago kind of thing. And we don't want to go back to a world where we suspect anybody who's not one of us as not being friendly to us or whatever. I think we shouldn't go overboard. That's what I would, and that's very hard to do because people like things black and white, and spectrum and are more challenging. But I would say, and there's a larger opinion of mine, and partly why I don't like dualities is that there's a reason that the rainbow at the end of the flood is right. God's symbol is a rainbow, all the colors, right?
So maybe this might be a good way to wrap.
Okay.
I think I have
an easy question.
I don't know if it's easy or not, but I think one of the things that engaged me about the book is the conversation around the nature of halakha, or the nature of Jewish law, and the suggestion that, again, you touched on in your remarks, that halakha needn't be thought of in a way that is binding or obligatory, but needs to be disrupted or reformed. And it struck me as being in line with conversations from both like Achad Ha'am and Mordechai Kaplan in earlier times, that we're trying to think about maybe a new kind of halakha or a new way of making law relevant. I guess the question I'd like to ask is, if law is not obligatory, what is your why?
Well, that's, what I was, I think I like the language of practice. And actually, in the book, I adopted a term from Isaac Mayer Wise, a leading Reform rabbi in the 19th century, who talked about minhag America. And at that moment, he thought Reform was clearly going to be the only form of American Judaism, as many people who said that sometime or another, turns out wrong. But and I think partly I just, we may not agree on this, but I just feel that halakha isn't really law, right? Because there's no enforcement method. So, and I realize that there's something lost, right? In other words, someone who has a complete commitment to Shabbat will never say, well, I have a really big deadline this week, so I'll take a break from Shabbat, right? Like that, it doesn't occur to them. It would be like, whatever, well, I'll just kill this person, but mostly I don't kill people. Like, no. So, I think there's something lost. But for me, for me, I just don't believe the Torah is the word of God, literally the word of God. So I just can't believe. But I think even with more broadly, it's that it's not law. So it's a self-commitment. It's a practice, right? I do it because I think it's important. And
important because?
So I think it's important because I think ultimately that what we are here for is to continue the work of creation. We are partners with God and continuing the world of creation. And the purpose is to make this world a better place, to do tikkun. And that's what we're about, and that's what we should be engaged in. And you try your best you can, knowing that you will often fail. And I think that's commitment enough.
I think that's a great way to end. And again, I'll remind folks that those ideas are in this wonderful book, Judaism Disrupted. We can offer Michael Strassfeld a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
And again, express both gratitude for your time and generosity to visit, and wish for safe travels. I have a few announcements I've been asked to make before we wrap up, but again, thank you to Rabbi Strassfeld. So announcement number one is on Tuesday, November 7th at 1 o'clock p.m. at the Social Hall, we have another in-person talk with novelist Yael Goldstein on the Goldstein Love on the possibilities. And on Sunday, November 12th, there's an online presentation from former head of the National Security Council of Israel, Giora Eiland, on the current situation in Israel, all sponsored by Under One Tent. So folks should please try to attend those events. And the book is available for sale outside. Rabbi Strassfeld kindly signed many copies. So if you'd like a signed copy of the book, please go and buy one. Thank you, everybody, and thank you again, Rabbi.
Thank you all. Really, thank you.